Today at the National Press Club, Senator Murray Watt, the Minister for the Environment and Water, will pitch and outline the details of the Albanese government's proposed environmental law reforms. Senator Watt with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club for today's Westpac address. My name is Tom Connell, I'm the club's president and also an anchor at Sky News. Today's guest, Senator Murray Watt, Minister Murray Watt as well, the Minister for Environment and Water. His speech, Environmental Law Reform, it's now or never. It's been 5 years since Graham Samuel handed down his landmark report, which essentially said the current laws are out of date and don't particularly help the environment nor major projects. Since then, we have had multiple attempts by both sides to change legislation. The closest arguably got was a deal seemingly stitched up by former Minister Tanya Plibersek with the Greens, which the Prime Minister decided was perhaps not a good look just before an election. Post-election, the PM has sent in Murray Watt. Murray Watt having tied off a few less loose ends in emergency services than industrial affairs in the past few years. Perhaps he's taken over from Christopher Pyne as the fixer. Quentin Tarantino aficionados might prefer Mr. Wolf. I haven't read the full 1,400-page bill, but I've read enough commentary to know if he can manage to avoid putting business and environment offside, that will be no mean feat. And then, of course, he can move on to the BOM website. You can follow the conversation today via X on @PressClubAust. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Murray Watt.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be back at the National Press Club. I've tried to make a point of speaking here in each of the portfolios I've had, and wherever I go into the future, I'll always have affection for the National Press Club. I'd of course like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We should always remember that our first peoples have managed nature on this continent for tens of thousands of years, and their knowledge remains valuable to this day. I want to thank Tom, Morris and everyone at the National Press Club for having me here today on what is a really important day for Australia's environment, our productivity and our community. About an hour and a half south of Brisbane and an hour west of Surfers Paradise is one of the most special natural environments in our country, Lamington National Park. It's part of the World Heritage listed Gondwana Rainforest Group. Its densely forested values and ranges are home to precious plants and animals, like the scrambling lily, the mountain wattle, earthworms that are found nowhere else in the world, and the eastern bristlebird. Having bushwalked in Lamington several times with family and friends over the years, it made sense for me to head there again soon after I was sworn in as the Federal Environment Minister around 5 short months ago. It was a close-up reminder of how precious nature is and how we owe it to those plants and animals and our kids and grandkids to do everything we can to protect it. That week, and every week, I'm reminded by my staff, my friends, and my constituents about how hard it is for younger people to find a home, how they want us to transition quickly to renewable power, to reduce our emissions and cut their power bills, how we need to access critical minerals, the fuel of the future, how we need a productivity burst to ensure living standards rise. And every week in this role, I'm reminded that our national environmental laws are failing all of these things. Those species in Lamington National Park, the young people seeking homes, and the renewables, critical minerals and productivity growth that we need. Today, we make a big step towards fixing this. Today, the Albanese government introduced into the House of Representatives the Environment Protection Reform Bill. It's an exciting day and one that has been coming for a very long time. 5 years ago to this very day, on October the 30th, 2020, esteemed Professor Graham Samuel AC delivered his independent review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act to then Environment Minister Susan Lee. I want to acknowledge Professor Samuel for his excellent work in delivering recommendations that were supported by environment, First Nations and industry stakeholders alike. His review exposed that our national environmental law is fundamentally broken. It's outdated and it's failing both the environment and business. He laid out a blueprint for reform to benefit both, not the environment or business, but both. At the time, his review was welcomed across the political aisle. Now opposition leader Susan Lee said, and I quote, "It is time to find a way past an adversarial approach and work together to create genuine reform that will protect our environment while keeping our economy strong." Greens environment spokesperson Sarah Hanson-Young at the time said, "The Samuel report sounds the alarm that Australia's environment is under unprecedented stress. Without urgent action and a full reform package, we risk losing our native wildlife and iconic natural places for good." And I agree with both Susan and Sarah on those remarks. But now, exactly 5 years later to the day, and after several attempts, if you believe the news reporting, the Coalition and the Greens are no closer to agreeing to these important reforms. The Coalition's internal splits see them lurch around, from claiming victory when they first saw the draft bill last week to saying the exact opposite the next day, only to then call for the bill to be split 3 days later, advocating for a split bill to avoid a split party room and angering business groups in the process. Meanwhile, the Greens Party's absolutism leads them yet again to threaten to block important environmental reform rather than make progress, just like they did last term. All while using these reforms as a fundraising vehicle to try to win back the seats they lost following that exact obstructionist approach. It's no wonder that environmental law reform in Australia has proven to be one of the hardest tasks in politics. But for all those obstacles, reform can and will be done. And with the hyper-partisan atmosphere of an election campaign behind us, now is the best opportunity to pass a balanced set of laws in the spirit of the Samuel Review that are firmly in the national interest. Put simply, it's now or never. I suspect this audience needs little explanation of why we need reform, but here's a quick summary. Any honest assessment of our environment must acknowledge the pressure that nature is under. The most recent State of the Environment report found that most indicators of the state and trend of plants and animals show decline, and the number of terrestrial and marine threatened species has risen. The report said we can expect further extinctions of Australian species over the next 2 decades unless current management effort and investment are substantially increased. Our government's commitment, under my friend and predecessor Tanya Plibersek, to conserve 30% of land and ocean is an important step to avoid these extinctions. But the job will be much harder without law reform that shifts the dial in favour of our environment. Equally, we've seen project approval times blow out, from a median timeframe of 48 weeks for an approval at the turn of the century to 118 weeks now, more than doubled, costing business time and money and strangling the homes, renewables and other projects we need. Analysis by my department on the economic value of these reforms shows annual savings of at least $500 million and potentially up to $7 billion to the national economy. So in short, reforming these laws is vital to protect our precious natural environment on which life depends, as do jobs in tourism, agriculture, resources and other industries. But this act is also incredibly important to giving business certainty and achieving our national priorities. Now, many commentators and politicians want to frame this legislation as a tug of war between the environment and the economy. They assert a false choice, that you can have one, but not the other. This is plain wrong. You don't have to choose between the environment and jobs and business. We can protect and improve our environment while removing duplication and speeding up approvals. And that was the secret sauce of Professor Samuel's report. In the same way, we've moved beyond the notion that you could act on climate change or have jobs. We have to move beyond this false choice when it comes to nature. Today, as the amendments are introduced into the Parliament, I want to take the opportunity to walk you through the key elements of the bill and outline how these reforms will deliver for both our national environment and our economy. When I started in this role a few months ago, I said the environmental reform train is leaving the station and that I wanted as many people on that train as possible, rather than shouting from the platform as it rushed by without them. And I've followed through on that. Yesterday, bringing up 100 meetings with key stakeholders, state and territory ministers, the Federal Coalition, Greens and independent parliamentarians. I've consulted everyone from BirdLife Australia to BHP and countless in between. My office and department have met even more, and I pay tribute to their enormous efforts as we've crammed 18 months' work into 5. They're the tired people up the front here. I want to acknowledge all the different stakeholder groups who've engaged in good faith with my team and I this year and over many years, from the Samuel Review to the consultations with Tanya on whose good work these reforms will build. That work has resulted in a balanced package of reforms centring on 3 key pillars, which have received almost universal endorsement. And those pillars are, firstly, preserving what's precious by strengthening environmental protection and restoration. Secondly, delivering a power surge for productivity through quicker project assessments and approvals. And thirdly, cementing these reforms by enshrining greater accountability and transparency in environmental decision making. Now, there's a reason why the suite of legislation we introduced in the House of Reps this morning is called the Environment Protection Reform Bills, because our national environmental law must protect our environment. And when this bill is passed, it will, with several demonstrable gains for nature. First, the reforms will create a new ministerial power to make national environmental standards, which will be regulations under the Act. These standards were the centrepiece of the Samuel Review, and the need for standards is broadly supported by stakeholders. Standards will set the boundaries for decisions to ensure they deliver improved environmental outcomes. Importantly, they will also provide certainty and guidance for business by setting clear and enforceable expectations and uplifting the quality and consistency of decision making. Until the power to create the standards is in the law and we pass the laws, we're unable to make them. But we have started work on them, knowing that people want to see the direction of travel. In the next few days, we'll release draft versions of the first 2 standards for consultation regarding matters of national environmental significance and environmental offsets. Drafting of the remaining proposed standards concerning matters such as First Nations engagement and environmental data is underway, and we will continue consulting on all the standards once the laws are passed. Professor Samuel made the point that it's vital these reforms not just protect but restore our precious natural environment. And that's why projects will be required by law to avoid, mitigate and repair damage to protected matters wherever possible. Any residual significant impacts on nationally protected matters must be fully offset to achieve a net gain for the environment, an improvement on the existing policy of achieving no net loss. Now, a net gain could be achieved either by the proponent directly delivering an offset or through an upfront financial contribution to a restoration fund managed by an independent statutory officer in the department. We'll seek to work closely with states and territories to align this with comparable funds in their jurisdictions. Now, this model is a win for the environment as it enables a more strategic approach to offsets that deliver bigger biodiversity outcomes and allows for larger investments in nature repair. The reforms will also clearly outline in legislation what is an unacceptable impact on the environment. Currently, the EPBC Act includes a clearly unacceptable category for decisions when they are referred for decision, but the term unacceptable is not defined, leaving people pretty unclear. So the unacceptable impact criteria in this bill will set clear, upfront and transparent criteria for impacts that simply cannot be approved, enabling clear decisions early in the process, as well as, of course, protecting our most special places. So what this means in practice is that if someone wants to build an apartment block in a Ramsar-listed wetland, or perish the thought if they wanted to mine Uluru, they'll get a pretty quick no, saving them time and money, not to mention saving our special places. The reforms will also enable the Minister to issue protection statements to clarify what a decision maker must consider during the approval of actions to protect threatened species or ecological communities, including unacceptable impacts and critical habitat where they've been defined. There will be higher penalties for the most significant breaches of environmental law, as well as environment protection orders for use in urgent circumstances to prevent and respond to major contraventions of the law. Now, these are just some of the reform measures that deliver more protection for the environment. But more than that, they start to shift the dial away from simply protecting the environment from harm towards restoring nature towards recovery. The second pillar of these reforms is delivering a power surge for productivity through quicker project assessments and approvals. I've already cited some of the figures on the economic cost of delayed projects, not to mention the community impact of slower approvals for housing, renewables and more. And the productivity benefits of these reforms have been underlined by former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry, who's with us today, who has said there is no more important productivity reform than passing these laws. And Ken, in his usual style, has said that if we can't do this, we should stop dreaming about more challenging options. So a key focus of our reforms is removing duplication in the federal and state approvals and assessment systems for projects, all while maintaining strong environmental standards. The current system, which requires proponents to navigate multiple assessment and approval processes across federal, state and territory jurisdictions, creates lengthy delays while delivering no benefit for the environment. Our new laws will enhance our ability to enter bilateral agreements, which would see states and territories undertake one set of assessments and, over time, approvals against both their own requirements and federal standards. This delivers on a key recommendation from Professor Samuel and would see proponents go through one assessment process rather than two, in some cases saving years of delay. Alongside this change, state and territory processes would need to be accredited to ensure that they meet the new national environmental standards, and the states and territories processes would be audited every 5 years to ensure they stay on track. These are important safeguards to ensure that federal environmental requirements are being met. Other aspects of the reforms to provide more efficient and robust project assessments include a new streamlined assessment pathway. This will significantly reduce the assessment timeframe for proponents who provide sufficient information upfront and provides an incentive to proponents to meet the standards upfront. In addition, the reforms will allow for the greater use of regional planning. Under this approach, we can work with other levels of government, industry and communities to identify upfront go zones and no-go zones in a particular region. This allows projects in areas of low environmental value to be approved quickly and gives clarity on areas where development is unlikely to proceed because of its high environmental value. This will also help overcome a weakness in the current laws in that they focus on project-by-project assessments and approval decisions without considering the cumulative impacts of those projects on the environment. So planning and managing development impacts at a regional or landscape scale can deliver better outcomes for the environment and for business. We also propose amendments to give business certainty by limiting frivolous and vexatious legal action, including by introducing a 28-day time limit for third parties to request a reconsideration of a decision that a project is a controlled action, aligning this time limit with those time limits that apply to appeals under other decisions under the Act. Finally, we're adopting Professor Samuel's recommendation that the Act should include a specific power in rare circumstances that are in the national interest, for the Minister to make a decision that is inconsistent with the national environmental standards. Such a decision would be accompanied by a statement of reasons which includes the environmental implications of the decision. To demonstrate the rare nature of these decisions, the bill refers to defence, security and national emergencies as the types of situations this power might be used. The third and final pillar is cementing these reforms by enshrining greater accountability and transparency in environmental decision making. Currently, the community lacks confidence in decisions made about the environment and in whether our laws are being properly enforced. Often those decisions are opaque and they're often questioned as to their evidence base and whether they were made for the right reasons. If these reforms are to endure, we need to rebuild confidence in decisions made under the Act. And critical to this task is the establishment of a new independent watchdog which can enforce those laws. Labor has gone to the past 2 elections promising an independent regulator for the environment, and we intend to deliver on that promise. The reforms establish Australia's first national EPA that brings together the regulatory functions of Australia's national environmental laws into one independent agency. The new agency would be a cornerstone of the environmental law reforms, ensuring independent compliance and enforcement and delegated decision making. In line with the recommendations of the Samuel Review, the EPA would have access to stronger new powers and increased penalties to better protect and restore Australia's unique environment. Under current laws, decision-making on project assessments and approvals is the responsibility of the Minister, who is democratically accountable. This will not change. And I note that this preservation of ministerial responsibility for decision-making is, to date, the one point of agreement between Labor, the Coalition and the Greens. The creation of a national EPA by the Albanese government is a huge step forward to lock in protections for nature, and it builds on Labor's strong environmental legacy. It's up there with Whitlam creating the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and ratifying the World Heritage Convention, which gave the federal government a powerful tool to defend precious natural or cultural heritage sites. And Hawke stopping the Franklin Dam, establishing Landcare and returning Uluru-Kata Tjuta National Park to its traditional owners, the 40th anniversary of which we celebrated just last weekend. Now, under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, we have the opportunity to cement more reforms and deliver lasting change to protect the environment. I particularly want to acknowledge the terrific members of the Labor Environment Action Network who are here today. They're the ones in the red and white shirts, if you haven't picked them already. And they've campaigned hard as Labor Party members to secure a change to Labor's platform to create a national EPA. And today, we took a big step towards delivering it. So thanks, guys. We're also delivering on Professor Samuel's recommendation that the Act should better harness and value First Nations knowledge about supporting healthy country built up over 60,000 years. The reforms will codify the involvement of First Nations people via the Indigenous Advisory Committee into the Commonwealth's environmental governance and decision making, including in the development of the national environmental standards. Finally, the reforms also introduced new emissions disclosure requirements. In keeping with Professor Samuel's recommendations, we haven't included a climate trigger in the legislation. Rather, the reforms will require major emitting project proponents to disclose estimates of Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions as part of gaining federal environmental approval. Proponents will also be required to disclose their plans to reduce those emissions and explain how those measures are consistent with government laws and policies. This will provide a clearer linkage to climate-related policies such as the safeguard mechanism, but will not be taken into account in project approval decisions. So in conclusion, as you can see, there is a lot in this bill. A lot for our environment, a lot for business, and a lot for our community. It's been a deliberate choice to introduce a comprehensive bill, much more comprehensive than any of the previous attempts at reform. And that's because we've got one shot at this. We've got a once-in-a-generation chance to deliver reforms that see our environment and business gain, just like Professor Samuel recommended 5 years ago today. Now, there is, of course, an alternative to passing these laws: doing nothing. And that's what will happen if the Coalition and the Greens continue their roles as the blockers and spoilers of Australian politics. Spinning wheels, allowing those species in Lamington National Park to decline, stopping homes being built, and holding back national productivity. I don't reckon that's what Australians want, and it's not what our government wants. For these reforms, it really is now or never. Now, I got into politics to get things done, not to keep putting on the back burner. So I'm voting for now, not never. Let's go and get this done. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister. You spoke about what you say was the false choice between, or the push and pull environment and business development, etc. Perhaps in the macro, that's the argument. On the micro, though, if we're talking about unacceptable impacts, if there's a situation where no matter what you do to change a project, if it goes ahead, it will likely mean a species becomes extinct. What happens then? Is that a decision by a minister on what's more important out of those two scenarios?
Well, I mean, without speculating about individual cases, the point about that definition of unacceptable impacts is that it's where the impacts on the environment simply cannot be avoided or mitigated. So the first choice for a proponent is to avoid or mitigate the environmental impacts. But as I say, I don't think you'd find many Australians out there who would say it's okay to go and mine Uluru or drill on the Great Barrier Reef or some really serious impact or threaten the viability of a species to drive it extinct. I don't think many Australians would accept that, and they'd say to proponents, we want you to change your proposal in a way that avoids or impacts or minimises those impacts. And frankly, if it can't be done, it won't happen. So, I mean, I think these are extreme examples rather than the usual run-of-the-mill situation. But I do think that strikes the balance between saying to business, we're not saying you can't build a project, we're just saying you can't have an unacceptable impact that is going to drive a species to extinction or completely leave habitat irreplaceable.
So there wouldn't ever be a project important enough to say this species, this project, the project wins. Is that what you're saying?
Not in the...
I know there was the ministerial inconsistent decisions, parking that, but under the normal circumstance, no species would deliberately go extinct under what you're saying.
I mean, our government has a policy of zero no extinctions to begin with, and my view is that the way these laws would apply is that if a project is going to drive a species extinct, then it will get a no. And I reckon I'd be pretty confident I'd get about 99% support in the community for that.
And it wouldn't matter how big the project is, how tiny the species is?
No, if it's unacceptable because it's going to drive a species to extinction or it's going to, mine Uluru, et cetera, then they'll get a no. And the benefit of that is obviously not just for the environment, but as I say, you often hear businesses saying they want quick yeses and quick nos. That's a way of getting a quick no. And frankly, not even bothering putting up a project and saving yourself the time and money involved.
Okay. First question from the floor, Mike Foley from the SMH and the Age.
Thanks, Minister. You said, nature is in decline, there's a case for urgent reform, and your changes to the Act will be done. You're confident can and will be done. Invoking, as you did, the Whitlam's achievement on national heritage laws on the Great Barrier Reef, Bob Hawke with conserving the Franklin River, I'm hoping today you could paint a picture for us, for Australians, that under these reforms that will be done, what will they see across the country, perhaps even by the end of this term, that will have benefited from these reforms? What's the tangible case for change, if you can explain to us some specific examples, real world?
Sure, from an environmental perspective?
Yeah, from the environment side, please, because we've had the case outlined a bit from business.
Sure. So from an environmental perspective, I think Graham Samuel noted himself in his report that these reforms weren't going to see an overnight change in terms of the decline of nature, but they're a really important tool in making sure that, as I say, we shift the dial. Graham talked a lot about, the current situation, managing decline. And that's why we've embedded these really important principles like net gain, the national environmental standards, to not just see that ongoing decline, but actually to start seeing nature recover. Now, this would operate in conjunction with a range of our other policies and programs and investments. But I would like to see, even by the end of this term, the beginnings of nature starting to recover. I mean, some of the offset arrangements, for example, that are required to achieve a net gain may involve proponents not just preserving existing bushland, but actually investing in degraded farmland, and bringing back nature into a way it used to be. That would clearly be a tangible gain for nature. Now, as I say, I want to manage expectations that we're not going to have, beautiful trees and birds and butterflies on every street overnight. But I do think that over time we will start to see that improvement. The commitment that Tanya made, that I've retained around the 30 by 30 by 2030, we're well on the way to achieving that target when it comes to the oceans. We've got more work to do when it comes to land conservation, and this, among our other investments, would be an important way of shifting it.
Is there any habitat in particular that's close to your heart in the travels that you've done so far that you could paint a picture for Aussies of what they might see in coming years, however long that may be, better preserved?
I guess through my time as the Agriculture Minister, I got to see some fantastic work by farmers in preserving land and investing in its restoration, and I got to see some land that had been pretty badly trashed through bad management. And I'd like to see some of those degraded sites start to turn around. And again, it's not going to happen overnight, but making those investments, requiring people to invest in restoration, is the kind of thing that we'd see happen in those sort of sites.
Jake Evans from the ABC.
Minister, the Coalition says that you've cherry-picked from Graham Samuel's review. Can you say with a straight face that you have honoured that review, and has Professor Samuel told you that himself?
I can absolutely say that the bill that we've introduced reflects the Graham Samuel's recommendations. I mean, if you walk your way through his recommendations, it covered, we need new national environmental standards. We need a restoration fund for offsets. We need a net gain principle for offsets. We need stronger penalties. We need to streamline the approvals and come to arrangements with states that see people go through one assessment rather than two. So time after time, the things that we've put in the bill are almost directly out of Graham's report. I haven't spoken to Graham in the last few days. I've noticed what he's had to say. I happen to agree with what he says about the need for the Coalition and the Greens to get behind this. I mean, Graham and a big team and a lot of Australians have been wanting this work done for 5 years. I think it's astonishing that 5 years on we still haven't got this done, and now's the time we can get it done. So I'll be working as hard as I can over the remainder of the year with both the Coalition and the Greens to get it done.
Katina Curtis from the West Australian.
Thanks, Minister, and glad to see you here in Canberra, not in WA again.
I have been a frequent visitor to WA, you may have noticed.
It seems to me that a key criticism that we've heard over the past week from both sides of this debate is that a lot of the promised benefits for the environment and for business are kind of off in the, to do once this legislation passes, and so they're taking a lot on faith. I'm thinking of the forestry exemptions or getting the bilateral agreements done with the states. So what guarantees can you give to people can you give guarantees that are more than just your say-so, that these things will happen? And would you, for instance, set a time frame of 6 months to get that bilateral agreement with WA done?
Thanks, Katina. I think with the greatest of respect to the people saying those things, it's a bit unrealistic to think that we could, commence, have standards ready to go day one, have an EPA up and running day one, have a bilateral agreement up day one. I mean, everyone understands, I think, how hard it has been to get to this stage of the process, and we haven't got a bill passed yet. But what I can say is that my department has already been working really hard on the implementation of these reforms. So that's why we've started having discussions with WA and other states about bilateral agreements. It's why the thinking is starting to go on about how we could get the EPA up and running, what its staffing requirements would be, what its procedures procedures would be. It's why we've started drafting national environmental standards. I mean, I can't make a national environmental standard until this bill is passed, because that gives me the power to do so. But notwithstanding that, we've drafted 2 of the most important national environmental standards and made really good progress on some of the others. So I think there's a lot of work that's been happening in terms of implementation. I mean, I think more broadly, based on what I'm seeing the Coalition and the Greens say, I mean, you would hardly expect them to be rolling over day one and saying we're going to back in the bill. They'd be pretty poor negotiators if they did that. Inevitably, they're going to be seeking concessions, seeking changes. I've said I'll talk with them about that. But I've said from day one, and Graham Samuel said this, no one is going to get 100% of what they want. If everyone wants 100% of what they want, we will get nothing, and we'll be stuck with a bill that's failing everyone. But if we get 80% of what people want, then we'll have a pretty good set of laws that deliver for both the environment and for business. So that's why we're going to keep pushing on, and we're going to get it done.
In terms of the EPA, will the head of the EPA have the stop work ability, and what check or balance will happen on that? Can they simply go pick up the phone and that project stopped in its tracks?
Well, so the way the bill is structured, it would be the EPA and the CEO of the EPA who would have the power to issue those stop work orders. One of the problems that we have at the moment is that from time to time we get members of the community reporting to us that they've got good reason to think that some really critical habitat is about to get cleared, or some other really serious damage that would be illegal is about to happen. But our current tools under the current legislation don't let us do anything about that before it happens. So all we can do is come in after that critical habitat has been levelled, or after that impact has happened, and find someone, and frankly not find them very much. So modern regulators across the field have the ability to get involved and stop bad behaviour happening before it happens. We don't currently have that power, but that is what would go to the EPA. In terms of how those decisions would be made, there are provisions within the bill that explain the kind of factors that need to be taken into account. There's got to be, I mean, this is not the exact wording, but there's got to be a very real fear or very real instance of that kind of action being taken. I've also heard, while I'm at it, there have been some claims that there's no opportunity to appeal those orders. That's simply not correct. There would be the ability to seek judicial review of those kind of decisions in the way that there are almost every other government decision.
Okay, so presumably initially the work could stop, but the appeal process could kick in after that.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea would be that the stop work order is issued. You'd like to think people would obey it. But if they have a belief that it's not valid or not justified, then they have the opportunity to challenge that decision through judicial review, just as people can challenge other government decisions.
Okay, Jack Quayle from The Australian.
Thank you very much, Minister Watt, for your address. I just wanted to ask about the national interest provision.
Yep.
According to the bill, would a minister be able to exercise that provision to approve, housing, energy, critical mineral projects that otherwise wouldn't comply with environmental standards?
What the bill itself says is that it directs, or the kind of examples or the situations in which those matters could occur are more related to defence and national security matters, national emergencies. There's got to be a really high bar before people can actually, before a minister can intervene and approve a project notwithstanding its environmental impacts. So I would expect they would be the types of things that would occur, rarely exercised, explained with a statement of reasons. And again, this is something Graham Samuel recommended. He recognised that elected governments should have the ability, in rare situations, to make a decision that is inconsistent with those national standards, but that by and large those standards should apply.
But still technically possible?
Well, I'm not going to give hypotheticals about the kind of situations that they could be used, but I think the bill, in referring to those types of matters around defence and national security and national emergencies, I think that gives you a pretty good indication.
So you don't have any concerns then that it could be exercised for those projects?
For other types of projects?
Yeah, for housing, critical minerals, energy projects.
Well, I'm not going to speculate about the kind of projects that they would be used for. They're the kind of things that we've got in mind in the bill.
You've got in mind, but I mean, you won't be the minister forever. You'll be fixing something else at some point. So isn't it about the power? What is the power? Could it be any project? Is the minister all powerful in that sense?
Well, the way the bill is structured is for an individual project, and what would be required if we're talking about a national interest approval is that the project would still go through the usual environmental assessment, but for argument, if the ultimate decision is that the project doesn't meet standards, that the minister still has the ability to make that decision. Now, I'm not going to get into, specifying every single situation in which that could be used, but what we've tried to do in the bill is give an indication of the kind of projects that we're talking about.
Okay, Ron Meisen from the AFR.
Thanks, Minister. I just want to ask you about two of the sort of chief criticisms from the Green side. One, the lawyers and the environment groups looking at what's required around climate disclosure are sort of looking at it and saying, okay, yes, projects have to disclose how, if they make more than 100,000 tonnes a year in emissions, have to disclose how they comply with the safeguard mechanism, but there's no actual requirement for the government to consider whether those disclosures are realistic, whether they actually would be workable. It's sort of just a receiving it and they put it aside and thank you very much. What's the merit of receiving that information if it's not considerable in the approvals process? And just one of the things that's part of the pathway to net zero plans is a massive increase in creation of forests, sort of put out there the size of Belgium, potentially the size of Tasmania's worth of new forest to achieve net zero. Criticism of the Greens, again, nothing in this bill on forestry. You've raised the potential for the environmental standards to be applied to regional forestry agreements. But how much have you thought about how what you're doing today influences those pathways that you've got to achieve to get net zero?
So the first point, sorry, I've already forgotten what the first one was.
It's a long question.
Climate disclosures.
Yeah.
So, as you know, Ron, Graham Samuel explicitly rejected the idea of a climate trigger, and his recommendation was, and the basis of that was that he recognised that governments had developed other policies to require proponents to reduce their emissions, in particular the safeguard mechanism. And he didn't see the benefit, and we don't see the benefit in duplicating those kind of requirements in a separate piece of legislation. What Graham did recommend as a transparency measure was that proponents should be required to disclose their emissions and provide an abatement plan for that. We've included in the bill also a requirement that proponents disclose how their project will meet government policies such as the safeguard mechanism. In terms of why we're doing that, I mean, I do think it is a good transparency measure, but more also it provides that direct linkage into policies like the safeguard mechanism. So it gives us early visibility of projects that are coming online that are likely to trigger the safeguard mechanism. There's always the option for the climate change minister to be making changes to the climate safeguard mechanism if they choose. So it's really about providing that linkage, providing early visibility of those types of projects. And to your point about, there's nothing that can be done if someone, falsifies their emissions or doesn't meet their emissions, the safeguard mechanism already has powers to fine proponents if they don't meet their requirements. So our view is that with a policy in place in the climate space that is, requiring reductions in emissions, takes action against those who don't meet their obligations, we don't need to do that here as well. In terms of forests, Tanya Plibersek, as the Minister, and I, coming in after her, have both said that our intention is to apply the national environmental standards to regional forestry agreements. And again, that's what Graham Samuel recommended. So we're still working through that, and that no doubt will be something that we'll work on through the debate and the passage of these reforms.
Thank you. Are you comfortable with all the monitoring at the moment or self-reporting of the so-called fugitive methane emissions of gas projects?
You're probably getting into Chris's portfolio rather than mine, so it's not something that I directly deal with a lot. I'm sure there are ways that we can improve those kind of things. We've always said, whether it be this law, the safeguard mechanism, all the various policies that we've got in place, that there's opportunities to review them. So I'm sure those kind of things will be considered.
Dan Javasbati from The Guardian.
Minister, thanks for your speech. Another question about the national interest proposal. Just if you're so certain that it wouldn't be used on certain types of projects, on fossil fuel projects, for instance, why not make that explicit in the legislation?
Well, the decision we made was to set out the framework for how one of those national interest decisions could be made. As I say, to give a flavour of the types of decisions that pathway would attract. I mean, we haven't, across the bill more broadly, we haven't gone about sort of saying what can't happen. It's more about saying what can happen. So, you know, if others want to raise those kind of things over the course of the debate, we'll listen to them as we will to every other proposal.
So you're potentially prepared to consider including explicit carve-outs for certain...
Well, what I've said is that we're at an early stage of the debate. We haven't received any amendments from anyone yet, but I'm open to listening to all parties about what changes they think are needed. But what I'm going to insist on is making sure the bill that makes its way through this parliament delivers demonstrable gains for both the environment and business. They're the principles in Graham Samuel's review, in the way I've approached this, and they're going to be part of this bill however it emerges from the parliament.
Eva Staszewska from SBS.
Thank you, Minister. The Samuel Review recommended that the Act require the Environment Minister to transparently demonstrate how Indigenous knowledge and science is considered in decision making. Will that transparency advice be mandated? And if not, what have you got to hide?
I think it's pretty clear that I don't have a lot to hide. I'm pretty shameless in getting out there talking to people. Well, the way I would envisage those sorts of recommendations being delivered is particularly through the standards that we're developing. So the bill, as I said in my speech, the bill includes reformed and improved consultation processes with particularly the Indigenous Advisory Committee and Hi Rowan, the chair who's here today. But as we develop the standards, including but not only the First Nations engagement standard, that's how we would be making sure that ministers take those matters into account and transparently disclose them. I do want to make the point that we don't want to consign all the First Nations stuff just to the First Nations engagement standard. We'll be consulting with First Nations people, particularly through the Indigenous Advisory Committee, on the development of all of those standards so that we make sure that First Nations knowledge is taken into account and therefore in the decision-making process.
So then will you commit to releasing that advice in the interest of transparency and accountability?
Yeah, I mean, every time a minister or a departmental or in the future EPA official makes a decision, they need to disclose the basis for those decisions. The handful of big controversial projects that I've dealt with since coming into the role are the basis for my decision is published on a website, and sometimes it forms the basis of a legal challenge. So we will be transparently disclosing those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Next question, Dana Daniel from the Canberra Times.
Thanks, Minister, for your speech. Your department's most recent published staff census said 3% had witnessed corruption such as cronyism, conflicts of interest. It's close to the APS average, so nothing too unusual there. But given what the new EPA would be dealing with and the powers it will have, what safeguards would there be to ensure the integrity of its decisions? And will you consider adding additional public reporting, conflict of interest disclosure logs for staff and things like that?
Look, I would expect, I mean, a lot of the development of these sort of policies is more being done by the department rather than me, but I would expect that there would be a clear code of conduct for people working at the EPA, which would rule those kind of things out. I'm sure there will be some sort of conflicts of interest register developed. I haven't personally turned my mind to those kind of things, but you know, we are the government who introduced a National Anti-Corruption Commission and we take it seriously. So we want to see those sorts of examples referred for investigation. I don't see the creation of an EPA as meaning that the likelihood of those kind of corrupt activities would increase. And obviously, you know, ensuring that the EPA has really strong integrity behind its decision making would be a really important principle for it. But as I say, I would expect that those kind of policies would be developed.
And just in terms of the size of the agency, do you have a figure for how many extra public servants will be needed?
I haven't come up with an estimate on that point yet. I mean, clearly, some of the people who undertake assessment, approval, compliance work within the department at the moment would move across to being part of that independent agency. It may or may not require a few more, but I can assure you that, and my department will tell you, that I'm not a minister who's into bloated bureaucracies, and we want to make sure it's an efficient group that has the resources it needs.
Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hi, Minister. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. You began the preface of your speech talking about how environmental law reforms are some of the most difficult in politics. I assume that in your role as Minister, you're concerned about impact and progress and pragmatism as well. But you only need to listen to critiques of people like Ken Henry to know that in this space, in this portfolio area, political leadership has failed us for decades and decades and decades, particularly if you're someone of my generation who, grew up on a healthy appetite of watching Captain Planet. What in your mind is the circuit breaker for this issue, for this area of law reform? It obviously isn't a one and done, but there seems to be a short-termism in this portfolio in particular that the political cycle and the cadence of someone in your position can't keep up with. So what part of these reforms will assure you in your mind that your legacy as Environment Minister will be adequate?
I think the way I think about it is that perhaps more than other portfolios, this portfolio, many of the actions that you take, whether it be as a minister or a departmental officer, may not be seen for some time to come. It kind of goes back to Mike's question earlier that, turning nature around isn't going to happen overnight. It'll take time to, restore those degraded farmlands or whatever it is. But what I've got to do, I think, is put the building blocks in place for a system that gets us there. That's what these reforms are about. If we can get to a point that proponents have got to achieve net gains, we're seeing restoration contributions, that we're stopping developments that are clearly unacceptable to the environment, that is going to have a clear beneficial impact for the environment, as is being able to cut through that red tape and get homes built and other things. So, I'm sure there will be things that I do in this role over the time I'm here that see a direct impact in terms of the protection of something. Getting the World Heritage listing of Murujuga, that's now there forever. But a lot of things that we will be doing are more about putting those building blocks in place. And that's why I think the National EPA is so important and is a real legacy piece for the Albanese government. We've never had a strong independent watchdog that enforces the law and really sets high standards for what kind of development should occur. That's going to benefit us for a very long time. So I guess that's the kind of way I'm approaching it.
David Spears from the ABC.
Minister, thanks for your address. The last time the government had a crack at changing these laws, Roger Cook, the WA Premier, shot them down. You said you've been talking to him or his government about this version. Are you confident that he's on board? Does it matter to the Commonwealth if he's not? And can you give us a sense of what's likely to be in the bilateral agreement that you're talking to the WA government about?
Sure. Yeah, look, I think it's well known that I've been to Perth 4 times since being in the role. It's no secret that there were serious issues in WA last time we had a crack at this, so I thought it was probably a pretty good idea to get over there and talk things through with people. It was the very first place I went to after being sworn in as the minister, in a pretty clear signal that I wanted to work constructively with people. Every time I've met with the Premier, it's been a really constructive meeting. He supports reform, there's no doubt about that, because he can see the damage that's occurring to the environment and the hold-up in approvals. We'll continue to talk with him about the detail, but I certainly think that he's broadly supportive of reforms. In terms of the bilateral, so where we've got to is that we are keen to sign a bilateral agreement with WA that would in the first instance allow them to do the assessments of projects. The only state that we currently have a functional bilateral assessment agreement with is New South Wales. And what that means is that for all of the projects in New South Wales that trigger the EPBC Act, the New South Wales can do the assessment of that project to meet our requirements at the same time as they're doing the assessment whether it meets their requirements. So rather than someone having to roll up to the New South Wales government, do an assessment, get their approval, then come to us, do an assessment, get our approval, we can actually cut through and have one assessment. And so that's where we'd like to get to with WA. That's where we'd like to get to with a lot of other states. I recently had a meeting of the federal, state and territory environment ministers, and we all agreed that we want to work together on reaching these kind of agreements, because let's face it, every state government is under the same pressure to deliver housing, to deliver renewables, to deliver other things, and is also seeing their environment decline. So there's a really strong appetite amongst state and territories to achieve those kind of agreements.
Thank you.
When it comes to, on one side, the environmental regulations and protection, and the other, the streamlining, will they start at the same time, or could there be a lag given the state accreditation requirement?
Look, there are different commencement dates set out for different parts of the Act. I can't remember exactly which date every part of the bill would start. We do want to get moving on reaching those kind of agreements. That's why we've started talking with WA now before we can do an agreement. I mean, we could do an agreement under the current laws. It would just be really obsolete by the time we pass the new laws. So there's a reason we've started that work with states, because we want to be able to get moving day one after these reforms are passed.
There could be a lag on the streamlining aspect, do you know?
Look, I think it will be different in different states. There will be some states that take a bit longer to reach those kind of agreements, but also one of the other ways of streamlining the approvals that I talked about was revamping regional planning. We've already started, I think it's 7 or 8 pilots of regional planning around the country. Southeast Queensland, there's a couple in Victoria, there's a North Queensland one focusing on wind farms, and all of that work is happening so that we can start implementing these reforms as quickly as possible. We don't want to get to a point where parts of the Act are working for a long time without the other parts. It is an integrated package, so we will be going as fast as we can once we get the bill passed.
Mike Foley again from the SMH and the Age.
Thanks, Minister. I just wanted to follow up on the discussion of the national interest provisions. One thing we haven't discussed in relation to that so far is this bill will set up a pathway to establish what you've called urgently needed national environmental standards to guide decision making and draw lines in the sand, I guess is a fair description of what can and can't be done. I just want to discuss the principle, if you could discuss for us the principles that you believe in, because environmental lawyers that I've spoken to say that there is a clear interpretation of the bill that you've set out increases ministerial discretion under the national interest provisions to give a yes or no on projects that would breach future environmental standards or breach existing protections. So my question is, to simplify, do you agree in principle that the Minister of the day should hold those powers, or should the Minister be subject to those new urgently needed national environmental standards you're going to create?
Yeah. So I guess the way I'd answer that, Mike, is to say that in all but those very rare instances where there is a demonstrable national interest, then ministers or EPA officials, as the minister's delegate, would be making decisions based on those national environmental standards. So that might be 99.9%, it might be 99%, that would be the business as usual process that the standards would apply. But there are going to be rare instances where for whatever national interest reason applies, that a minister should have the ability to make a decision that doesn't meet the national environmental standards. And remember, this comes straight out of Graham Samuel's report. He made that recommendation despite having recommended the standards. So it's about just providing that opportunity in those rare circumstances. But as I say, the normal situation that would apply almost all of the time would be that they'd go through the usual process with those standards applying.
And you're, I guess on principle, you're comfortable to trust future ministers that they will keep it rare?
Well, I'm very confident that the Australian people would keep those ministers accountable. I mean, we are one of the reasons that we've stuck with the current system of having ministers having a decision-making power for a project, not national interest exemption ones, but your usual powers, is that, you know, we are elected, we go to the polls every 3 years, we turn up at the National Press Club, we are, I think, very accountable for our decisions, and we do think that there needs to be that opportunity for elected ministers to make those sorts of decisions. As I say, in almost every case, subject to those standards, but in those very rare instances, having the ability to move on.
Accountable, I mean, yeah, sure, there's an election, but you don't go in and tick yes or no to an environmental project. Would it take a Franklin-level protest to shift you? Would that be
well, actually, we actually ministers do go in and sometimes give ticks to projects. So the current
voters don't. I mean,
voters, no. Well, I mean, you know, We
I
have,
haven't
an
seen it on
we,
a ballot
we
paper.
have an election every 3 years where people choose who their government will be and decide, you know, for whatever reason that they'll back that person or that person. And we have to be able to get on and make decisions rather than going back to the public about every single decision that's made. I know some countries have tried that approach and it doesn't tend to
I was
work
less
very
saying
well.
that and more about the ministerial power.
Yeah.
Let's get to Ron Meisen from the AFR.
Minister, I think this is the last question, so I'm slightly off topic. You've got question time coming up. It's going to be an extended question time because the Coalition, the Crossbench and the Greens have banded together to punish you for secrecy, for not releasing reports. Are you intending on sort of playing ball with this extended question time? Are you potentially going to have a bit of a walkout? What's the plan? Or we hear that deputy chairs, coalition deputy chairs, could be sacked as a consequence. You're a senator. You're going to be in that house very soon. How are you going to play it?
Well, I think you've probably noticed, Ron, I love question time. The only thing I don't love about question time is that the opposition never ask me a question. And the Greens have started going off it as well. So maybe I've got to be, I don't know, a bit shyer or something. I'm not going to spoil the fun this afternoon. So there might be more interest in Senate question time than there usually is.
Thank you.
Probably a low bar, I'd say, on that. But on
Yeah, I haven't
note,
seen you in the gallery. I haven't seen you in the gallery. It's a higher
I'll come in
standard of
today. It
question.
sounds like it'll be worth it. You'll see me there at 2 p.m. I'll end the note on thanking you rather than sledging you. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Minister Murray Watt
Thanks.
today.
Thank you.
We've got as well.
Thanks, mate.